The smell was the first thing. Before the evidence bags, before the photographs, before the count that would eventually reach 33, there was the smell that rose from beneath the floorboards of a house on West Somerdale Avenue in Norwood Park Township, a quiet residential suburb on the northwest side of Chicago. A house with a neat yard and a covered porch and a neighborhood of people who knew the man who lived there, who had eaten his food and attended his parties and watched him perform at community events in the white grease paint and red wig of a clown named Pogo. The smell was the thing the neighbors had noticed for years and explained away. Sewer problems. Dead animals beneath the foundation. The settling damp of a house built in the way many suburban Chicago houses of that era were built, with a crawl space beneath the main floor that occasionally collected moisture and occasionally, depending on the season and the drainage, produced the kind of smell that homeowners grimaced at and called the plumber for and eventually learned to ignore. It was December 1978 when investigators finally went beneath the floor of the house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, and what they found there redefined, for everyone who was present and for many who were not, what it was possible for a life to conceal. Not a sewer problem, not a dead animal. The investigators who descended into that crawl space and understood what they were looking at have described the experience in terms that do not lend themselves to the ordinary vocabulary of crime scene investigation, in terms that reach instead for something closer to the language of confronting something that should not exist in the suburban architecture of an American neighborhood. In the home of a man who had recently been photographed shaking hands at a political fundraiser, who coached youth sports, who ran a successful contracting business, who had been photographed the previous May with the First Lady of the United States. What they found was 33 young men and boys. 29 of them were in or near the crawl space beneath the house where John Wayne Gacy had lived, cooked, entertained, conducted business, and slept for 6 years. 4 more had been thrown from bridges into the Des Plaines River when the crawl space ran out of room, when the ground could not accommodate any more of what he had put into it. The youngest was 14 years old. The oldest was in his mid-30s. Most were between 15 and 20, the age range of people who move through the world with a specific kind of vulnerability, young enough to trust adults in positions of apparent authority, old enough to be out in the world alone, not yet old enough to have developed the full spectrum of wariness that experience eventually provides. The story of how a man buries 33 people beneath his house and continues to host barbecues for the neighbors is, in one sense, the story of an individual psychopathology, of a depth and a specificity that continues to defy complete clinical understanding. In another sense, and perhaps the more important one, it is a story about the world around the house, about the neighbors and the investigators, and the systems and the social prejudices that made ignoring the smell the easier thing to do, that made each individual piece of evidence seem insufficient on its own to justify the effort that confronting what was beneath the floor would have required. It is a story about how ordinariness is the most effective concealment, about how a monster who presents himself as a neighbor and a contractor and a community figure and a clown is very much harder to see as a monster than the versions of evil that announce themselves through visible strangeness. John Wayne Gacy was born on the 17th of March, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, the second of 3 children of John Stanley Gacy and Marion Robinson Gacy. His father was a machinist, a World War I veteran, a man whose drinking had curdled over the years into something harder and more specific, a contempt for weakness in any form that was directed with particular force at his younger son, the boy who was soft and overweight and prone to health problems, and who would never, no matter what he achieved in his life, achieve the particular kind of hard masculine competence that John Stanley Gacy valued above everything else. The elder Gacy beat his children with a razor strop and verbally demolished his son, in particular, with a consistency that the son later described, in the many interviews he gave in his years on death row, as having permanently shaped his understanding of himself and of the world. He called his son a sissy and worse. He predicted his son would come to nothing. He expressed contempt for the boy's physicality, his friendships, his interests. He was, by every account of those who knew the family, a difficult and sometimes frightening man, and the psychological damage he inflicted on the son, who would become one of the most destructive serial killers in American history, has been examined by psychologists and criminologists for decades, without producing a consensus on the precise nature of the relationship between what happened in that Chicago household and what happened later in the crawlspace of the house on West Somerdale Avenue. Trauma does not inevitably produce violence. Most people who suffer childhoods as damaging as Gacy's do not kill anyone. But the texture of his early years is part of the record, and the record requires that it be included. Gacy's medical history complicated his childhood in ways that extended beyond his father's contempt. He suffered from an undiagnosed heart condition for much of his youth, a condition that produced blackouts and that kept him from the physical activities that might otherwise have shaped his development differently. At 11, he suffered a serious head injury when he was struck by a playground swing, and some researchers have noted this injury as potentially significant in the neurological history of his violence, though the causal weight of such physical events in the development of criminal behavior remains genuinely contested in the medical literature. What is clear is that Gacy grew up as a child who experienced his own body as an obstacle, as something that betrayed him regularly and kept him from the kind of masculine performance his father demanded, and that this experience of the body as unreliable and inadequate remained with him in forms that would express themselves, much later, in ways that no pediatrician's assessment of his childhood condition would have made predictable. He was an intelligent child, engaged and sociable in ways that coexisted with the damage being done at home, capable of the kind of surface warmth that the people around him responded to and that would serve him well throughout his adult life, as a kind of ongoing performance of the decent, regular, approachable man he wanted the world to see. He worked hard at being liked. He worked hard at being competent and useful and central to whatever community he was part of, qualities that his father had denied him in the home, and that he therefore pursued with a particular urgency outside it, needing to accumulate from the world the affirmation that the household withheld. He dropped out of high school and spent several years working various jobs in various cities before eventually settling into a management position with the Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise operation in Waterloo, Iowa. He had, by then, married his first wife, Marlyn Myers, the daughter of his employer, and they had 2 children and a life that, from the outside, looked like the successful early career trajectory of a capable young man making his way in post-war middle-class America. He was active in the JCs, the civic organization for young professionals, that gave him the kind of community platform he had always sought, the podium from which to be recognized and applauded, to be the man people were glad to see, rather than the sissy his father had found so easy to dismiss. The first conviction came in 1968. A teenage employee named Donald Voorhees came forward with allegations that Gacy had sexually assaulted him, and an investigation revealed that there had been other victims among the young men Gacy managed in Waterloo. He was charged with sodomy. In a legal proceeding whose outcome has been examined from multiple angles in the years since, Gacy hired a young man he was using for sexual purposes to beat Voorhees badly enough to deter him from testifying, a plan that failed when the young man was caught before he could carry it out. Gacy was convicted and sentenced to 10 years at the Iowa State Reformatory at Anamosa. He served 18 months. He was a model prisoner. He organized events and cooked for inmates and the warden and performed the same social machinery that had always served him well, the machinery of being useful and personable, and the kind of man institutional authorities found easy to recommend for parole. He was released in 1970, having left behind in Iowa a failed marriage, 2 children, and a conviction for sexually assaulting teenage boys, none of which appeared, to the Iowa Board of Parole, to outweigh the evidence of his model behavior during his incarceration. He moved back to Chicago and lived with his mother briefly before finding his feet in the city in which the worst of what he was going to do would occur. He remarried in 1972, a woman named Carol Hoff, who had 2 daughters from a previous marriage and who had known Gacy before his Iowa conviction, and who chose, after his release, to rebuild a connection with him that she believed represented a future. She would later describe the marriage as deteriorating almost from the beginning, that Gacy showed little romantic interest in her and was increasingly absent and increasingly strange, and that the house they shared developed, over the years they lived in it, a smell she could not identify and could not get him to adequately explain. She divorced him in 1976. She had noticed the smell. She had noticed the young men. She had noticed enough to leave, but not, as she has acknowledged in subsequent accounts, enough to report. The PVM contracting company that Gacy founded in the early 1970s, the initials standing for painting, decorating, and maintenance, was a genuine and moderately successful business that employed a rotating crew of young workers, many of them teenagers or men in their early 20s, recruited through word of mouth and through the specific social gravity that Gacy had always been able to generate, the gravity of a capable older man with authority and resources who took an interest in young men who were drifting, who offered them work and money and the company of someone who seemed to genuinely see them. This social gravity was not performed or manufactured for cynical purposes alone. Gacy was, in the actual conduct of the business, a capable contractor. His crews did real work. His clients were satisfied. The business prospered in the way that small contracting businesses prosper, when the person running them is organized and personable and follows through on commitments. The horror of what the business also was, the source of access to a specific and repeated category of victim, did not erase the reality of its ordinary commercial function, and this coexistence of the real and the monstrous is one of the features of the case that makes it so difficult to comprehend in conventional terms. He was also, during this period, a figure of some consequence in the Democratic Party politics of his Chicago neighborhood. He served as a precinct captain. He attended political events. He shook hands and worked rooms, and was the kind of reliable local organizer that political operations depend on and that party officials remember fondly. It was through this activity that he came, in May of 1978, to attend a fundraiser in Washington, at which he was photographed with Rosalind Carter, the wife of the sitting President of the United States. The photograph was taken by a Secret Service agent. Gacy had been issued a security clearance for the event. 7 months later, he would be arrested for 33 murders. The years between 1972 and 1978 were the years of the killing, and they were also the years of the neighborhood barbecues and the Little League and the Pogo the Clown performances at hospitals and community events, and the birthday parties of children who lived nearby, years during which John Wayne Gacy constructed and maintained, with extraordinary consistency and what appears in retrospect to have been genuine effort, the public persona of a man who was exactly what he appeared to be. The effort required for this parallel performance, the sustained management of a social identity that bore essentially no relationship to the reality of what he was doing in the crawl space beneath his house, is itself one of the most disturbing features of the case, because it suggests a level of compartmentalization that most people cannot fully imagine, a capacity to move between worlds so distinct that the people in one of them had no access to the other, and no mechanism for suspecting its existence. The first murder, as best as investigators have been able to establish the timeline, occurred on the 3rd of January, 1972, less than 2 years after Gacy returned to Chicago from Iowa. The victim was Timothy Jack McCoy, 15 years old, from Omaha, Nebraska. McCoy had been traveling by bus and was at the Chicago Greyhound terminal when Gacy encountered him and, in the manner he would refine over the following years, offered him accommodation for the night before his next connection. What happened at the house on West Summerdale Avenue that night established a pattern, though Gacy claimed for years that the first killing was accidental, that he had woken to find McCoy in the kitchen with a knife that he believed was being used to threaten him, and that the violence that followed had been a form of self-defense that he had found, to his own later professed surprise, to be accompanied by sexual satisfaction. He described this moment as the discovery of something in himself, using language that implied revelation rather than choice, a framing that the psychologists who evaluated him would find significant, and that the jury who heard his insanity defense would find entirely unconvincing. The subsequent murders were not accidents by any meaningful definition of the word. They were acts of deliberate predation, preceded by deliberate planning, executed with deliberate method, and followed by deliberate concealment. Gacy selected his victims from a specific population, young men and teenage boys who were in situations of reduced social protection, who were drifting between jobs or between addresses or between family situations that had failed them, who had the specific combination of financial need and social isolation that made them responsive to the offer of work, money, or simple company. He recruited them at the Greyhound terminal. He recruited them through the networks of young employees who rotated through PDM contracting. He picked up hitchhikers. He approached young men at gay bars at a time when homosexuality carried enough social stigma that a young man who had been to such a place had particular reasons not to want to explain publicly where he had been or whom he had been with. He used what he called the rope trick to subdue them, a method of restraint he presented to his victims at the moment of its use as a magic trick or a game, something he could perform that demonstrated strength or dexterity, and which, in its actual execution, left the victim unable to resist. He sometimes used chloroform. He sometimes used handcuffs, which he was entitled to possess as a result of his work as a precinct captain, giving him a courtesy law enforcement identification. He would show his victims the handcuffs as a joke or a novelty item, and, in the moment of their curiosity or their amusement, apply them. The specific mechanics of how he moved from the initial presentation of the restraint to the act of murder have been described in the confession he eventually gave and in the subsequent testimonies of victims who survived, and they have a quality of practiced efficiency that speaks to someone for whom the method had been refined through repetition into something approaching routine. He buried the bodies in the crawl space, most of them shoveling lime over the bodies to accelerate decomposition and reduce the smell that was, despite his efforts, noticeable to his neighbors and to the second wife who eventually left him. He dug the crawl space out further as the bodies accumulated, creating more room, managing the geometry of the space beneath his house, with the same practical competence he brought to his contracting work, calculating angles and depths and the physical logistics of concealment, with an attention to detail that is, in the context of what was being concealed, almost impossible to contemplate without some form of distress. He continued to host parties. These detail, which appears in nearly every account of the Gacy case, and which has never lost its capacity to disturb, deserves more than a passing mention, because it speaks to something essential about both Gacy's psychology and about the nature of the concealment he had achieved. The parties were real. The food was real. Gacy was a capable cook who took evident pleasure in feeding people, who was known for the quality of his barbecues, who invited his neighbors and his employees and his political contacts, and who was, by the accounts of those who attended, a genuine and attentive host. The people who ate at his table had no idea what was beneath the floorboards of the house where they sat. The neighbors who noticed the smell explained it to themselves in the ways that neighbors explain away the strange, but not the impossible, because the impossible, the thing that was actually the cause of the smell, was too far outside the range of what could be attributed to a man they knew and liked and saw regularly at community events. The failure to stop Gacy before 1978 was not a failure of any single moment, but a failure distributed across years, across multiple institutional encounters, across the specific social conditions of the time that made his victims less visible as victims and made their disappearances less urgently investigated than the disappearances of other kinds of people in other kinds of circumstances. Many of the young men Gacy killed were transient or semi-transient, people whose social roots in any particular place were shallow enough that their absence was not immediately registered as a disappearance requiring investigation. Some of them were gay, at a time and in a social environment where homosexuality was still criminal in some jurisdictions, and where the fear of exposure that came with it discouraged both reporting and investigation. Some of them were minors who had run away from troubled home situations, whose absence from those home situations was itself not immediately surprising to the people who might have been expected to report them missing. The specific population from which Gacy selected his victims was, in the language that investigators and social workers have developed in the years since to describe this phenomenon, a population of less missed people, people whose disappearance produced less immediate institutional response because their lives had already been structured by the various kinds of marginalization that reduce the volume of the alarm that absence triggers. The systemic failures were not only about the victims. There were direct encounters with law enforcement, direct moments when the investigation that would eventually expose Gacy could have begun years earlier, direct occasions when the information available was, in retrospect, sufficient to have triggered a serious inquiry if the information had been taken seriously by the people who received it. In 1975, a young man who had survived an encounter with Gacy told investigators that Gacy had drugged and assaulted him. The report went nowhere. In 1976, similar complaints were made. In 1977, Jeffrey Rignall was chloroformed in Gacy's car, taken to the house on West Somerdale Avenue, assaulted over a period of hours, and left in Lincoln Park. Rignall was conscious enough at some point during the assault to notice specific details of the route Gacy had driven, and he spent weeks afterward in a personal investigation that eventually led him to identify Gacy's car and ultimately Gacy himself. He went to the police. He filed a formal complaint. The handling of that complaint, the pace with which it was investigated, and the degree of institutional urgency applied to a young man reporting that he had been assaulted by someone he had identified, is one of the most documented institutional failures in the case's history, a failure that has been attributed to the specific social conditions of the time, to the bias against gay male victims that structured law enforcement responses in that era, to the sheer administrative backlog of a large urban police department, and to the specific credibility gap that existed between the word of someone like Jeffrey Rignall and the word of a contractor and Democratic Party precinct captain with a photo ID and a photo with the First Lady and a yard full of friendly neighbors. Gacy was eventually charged with misdemeanor battery in connection with Rignall's complaint, more than a year after the original report. He was fined $1,000. He did not stop killing. The specific investigation that would ultimately expose him began with the disappearance of Robert Piest on the 11th of December, 1978. Robert Piest was 15 years old and worked part-time at a pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois, a suburb northwest of Chicago. On the evening of the 11th, he told his mother, who had come to the pharmacy to give him a ride home for her birthday celebration, that he needed a few minutes to speak with a contractor who wanted to offer him a job. He went outside to speak with the contractor. He did not come back. His mother, Elizabeth Piest, reported her son missing that same night. She was, by every account of those who worked the case, a woman of extraordinary determination and persistence, a woman who was not going to accept the ordinary institutional pace of a missing persons investigation when the person missing was her 15-year-old son, who had last been seen alive, going to speak with a contractor whose name she was able to learn through the pharmacy's owner. That name was John Wayne Gacy. The investigator assigned to the case, Lieutenant Joseph Kozenchak of the Des Plaines Police Department, ran Gacy's name and found the Iowa conviction. He drove to the house on West Summerdale Avenue on the evening of December 13, 1978, the second day after Piest's disappearance, and spoke with Gacy at the door. Gacy acknowledged that he had been at the pharmacy on the night in question. He said he had not met with Robert Piest. He was calm. He was the kind of man who seemed, at the door of his own house on a December evening, entirely in command of himself. Kozenchak requested that Gacy come to the station to give a statement. Gacy agreed, but asked if he could take care of some business first. He arrived at the station hours later, in a manner that communicated the unhurried confidence of someone who did not regard his situation as urgent. He returned to his house that night and made phone calls. He made several phone calls. The investigators who were monitoring him by this point have noted that several of those calls suggested a man managing the logistics of an emergency without fully understanding how advanced the emergency already was, a man who believed he still had time to manage what was happening to him, whose confidence in his own capacity to contain the situation had not yet been fully overridden by the specific circumstances that were converging on him. A search warrant was obtained for the house on West Summerdale Avenue and executed on the 13th of December, 1978. The investigators who entered the house found a range of evidence that, individually, could each be explained away, and that, together, told a story that only the full investigation would ultimately read clearly. They found handcuffs. They found a police badge. They found items of clothing that did not match Gacy's description. They found, in the crawl space, the smell. They looked at the crawl space but did not excavate it. The warrant was limited in its scope. The investigators who entered it that day have described, in subsequent accounts, the smell and their decision to attribute it to the accumulated moisture of a water-damaged foundation, a decision that, given everything they subsequently learned, they have returned to repeatedly in the years since. Gacy was placed under surveillance. He was followed by investigators in shifts, 6 men watching the house and the man who lived in it through the cold December days of 1978. He knew he was being watched. He acknowledged it, with the peculiar and almost performative self-possession that characterized his public manner even now, waving at the investigators who sat outside his house, bringing them coffee on at least one occasion, conducting himself throughout the surveillance with the demeanor of a man who had nothing to hide, and found the whole business faintly amusing. This performance of innocence in the face of the investigation was consistent with the performance of ordinariness he had maintained for years, and it appears to have served, even now, its intended function of creating enough ambiguity and enough apparent normalcy that the pace of the investigation remained, for a few days longer, slower than the situation warranted. In the days that followed, additional evidence connected Gacy to Piest. A receipt from the pharmacy was found in the house during a subsequent search. A young man who had worked for PDM Contracting came forward to tell investigators that Gacy had assaulted him, that he had been held against his will in the house, and had barely escaped. The investigation that had begun as a missing persons case was hardening into something else, something that the investigators involved were beginning to understand but had not yet fully confirmed. On the 21st of December, 1978, an investigator named Robert Schultz entered the crawl space beneath the house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue with a flashlight and a sufficient depth of purpose to do what had not quite been done 8 days earlier, which was to look at what was actually there. He found human remains. He came back up through the trapdoor into the house, and the investigation became, in that moment, something different from what it had been, became something that would require the kind of resources and the kind of sustained institutional effort that the disappearance of a 15-year-old boy had not yet produced. They called John Wayne Gacy in on the 22nd of December. He was brought to the police station and told what had been found, or implied it had been found, and there is a moment in the account of that interview, a moment that has been described by the investigators who were present, when the performance collapsed, when the man who had waved at the surveillance cars and brought coffee to the watchers and maintained for 6 years the most extraordinary sustained imposture in the history of American suburban crime, simply stopped. He said, almost quietly, that he wanted to speak with his attorney. And then, before or around that conversation, he began to talk. He began to confess. He described approximately 30 killings. He said he had gotten in deep. He said the devil was inside him. He used language that reached for the territory of diminished responsibility without quite landing in it. Language that was already, in those first hours of confession, shaped by something more calculating than simple horror at his own actions. Language that an attorney might later stand behind and call evidence of mental illness. The excavation of the crawl space at West Summerdale Avenue became the largest forensic undertaking in Cook County history to that point. Investigators worked through the December cold, bringing up the remains of 29 young men and boys from the earth beneath the house, where a contractor had hosted parties and performed as a clown and managed a political district and lived a life that had been, in every visible dimension, entirely ordinary. The bodies were in various states of decomposition. Many could not be immediately identified. The investigation that began with the disappearance of Robert Piest would extend, in its identification work, across decades, with the last DNA identifications occurring decades after the night the search warrant was served. 4 additional victims had been thrown from bridges into the Des Plaines River, discarded when the crawl space was full, when the geometry of concealment had reached its physical limit, and Gacy had had to find another way. One of those 4 was Robert Piest. His body was recovered from the Illinois River in April of 1979, 4 months after he had gone to speak with a contractor about a job. John Wayne Gacy was charged with 33 counts of murder. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, which was the only defense available to him once the physical evidence had removed the possibility of denying what had happened. His attorneys mounted a case, arguing that Gacy suffered from a severe personality disorder, possibly multiple personality disorder, that produced a dissociative state in which a separate entity within him was responsible for the killings, an entity that the real John Gacy did not control and for which he could not be held criminally responsible. They brought expert witnesses who described his psychology in clinical terms that reached, sometimes compellingly, for a diagnosis that might explain what no simpler diagnosis could explain. The prosecution presented 33 counts of murder. They presented the evidence from the crawl space. They presented the surviving victims who described what had been done to them. They presented the rope trick and the handcuffs and the purchasing of lime and the logistics of concealment as evidence not of an entity beyond Gacy's control, but of a man who had, with full awareness and full intention, killed 33 people and buried them and continued to live above them. The prosecution's expert witnesses described a man who knew exactly what he was doing, who had taken elaborate precautions to ensure that he was not caught, and who was therefore, by the legal standard the jury was being asked to apply, entirely responsible for what he had done. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They found John Wayne Gacy guilty of 33 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death on all counts. He was transferred to Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois, where he spent 14 years on death row. Those years produced their own distinctive record of who he was and how he understood himself, a record that is in some ways as disturbing as the record of the crimes themselves, because it reveals the interior architecture of a man who had murdered 33 people and had processed this fact in a way that left his essential self-regard essentially intact. He gave interviews. He spoke to journalists and criminologists and true crime writers and producers with a consistency and a willingness that reflected his enduring need for the same social platform he had always sought, the attention and the recognition and the status of being someone whose words were worth recording. In these interviews, he presented himself in ways that cycled through several distinct modes, none of them characterized by anything resembling the full acceptance of responsibility that 33 murders might seem to demand. He portrayed himself as a victim of his father, of the legal system, of the investigators he claimed had violated his constitutional rights in conducting the search. He suggested that there had been other people involved in the killings, that he had not acted alone, a suggestion that investigators examined and found unsupported by any credible evidence. He insisted that he was not the monster the media had made him into, a claim that, given the evidence of what he had done and where he had done it, and across how many years and to how many people, requires a particular kind of self-regard to maintain with any apparent conviction. He painted. On death row at Menard, John Wayne Gacy produced hundreds of paintings, many of them self-portraits, and many of them in a detail that has attracted more attention than almost anything else from his death row years, paintings of clowns. Pogo de clown, rendered in acrylic, in various poses and various settings, the white face and the red wig, and the painted grin of the character he had performed at hospitals and community events and children's parties. These paintings were sold, through various channels, to collectors who wanted them, and they sold for amounts that varied from a few $100s to considerably more, purchased by people whose interest in them was various, and in some cases hard to account for, and in some cases entirely accountable as a kind of dark collecting impulse that is not rare among people drawn to the artifacts of extreme crime. There are people who own John Wayne Gacy paintings. This is a fact that continues to disturb, not because the paintings themselves have any power to harm, but because of what the market for them reveals about the category of fascination the Gacy case occupies in the American imagination, a fascination that has always run the risk of displacing the 33 victims with the figure of the killer, of making Gacy the center of a story whose moral center should be elsewhere. He appealed his conviction on multiple grounds across the 14 years he spent on death row, using the legal process with the same methodical competence he had applied to everything else in his life, mining each available avenue until it was exhausted, and then finding another. None of the appeals produced the reversal or the stay he needed. The courts that reviewed his case, the Illinois Supreme Court, the federal courts, the United States Supreme Court, found each time that the trial had been conducted fairly and that the evidence had been sufficient and that the verdict and the sentence were legally sound. On the 10th of May, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Joliet, Illinois. He was 52 years old. His last meal was fried chicken and fried shrimp and strawberry shortcake, a choice that journalists covering the execution noted and that produced, in some of the people who read about it, a specific and visceral revulsion, the image of the man who had hosted barbecues for his neighbors, sitting down to one final meal, chosen with the same appetite that had always been his. His last words, according to the accounts of those present, were that killing him would not bring back a single one of his victims. This statement is true in the narrow sense in which he intended it, that no execution reverses a death, and deeply false in every other sense that the word justice might be intended to encompass, because what his execution represented was not a claim of reversal, but a claim of accountability, the belated and imperfect, but nonetheless consequential assertion that 33 murders are not compatible with continuing to live. Outside the prison, a crowd had gathered, not unlike the crowd that had gathered outside Stateville when Ted Bundy was executed in Florida 5 years before. People who had come to mark the moment with whatever feelings the moment produced in them, feelings that were complicated and various, and not all of them coherent, but that collectively expressed something real about how deeply the case had entered the American consciousness over the decade and a half since the crawl space was discovered. His brain was removed at the request of a neurologist who had studied his case and who believed that brain imaging might reveal abnormalities that would contribute to the scientific understanding of extreme violent pathology. The neurologist later donated the specimen to the University of Illinois. It sits, presumably, somewhere in a medical archive, the physical material of the mind that planned and executed 33 murders, and then spent 14 years describing them to journalists, with a composure that no ordinary emotional vocabulary can adequately characterize. The identification of Gacy's victims has continued in the decades since his execution, driven by the development of DNA technology and by the sustained commitment of investigators and family members who refused to accept that the unknown victims would remain unknown forever. For years after the executions, several of the bodies recovered from the crawl space, and the river remained without names, young men and boys who had been in the specific population of people whose absence did not generate immediate institutional attention, whose families either did not know they were dead or did not know where the body they were missing could be found. The Cook County Sheriff's Office has maintained an active effort to identify the remaining unknown victims through DNA analysis, matching genetic material recovered from the remains against profiles submitted by families searching for missing relatives. This effort has, over the years, produced identifications that came decades after the deaths themselves, identifications that found families who had been waiting for information for 30 or 40 years and delivered to them, finally, a specific and terrible knowledge. One of the challenges of this work has been reaching the right families, finding the people who knew that someone they loved had gone missing in the 1970s, but who had no way of knowing that the missing person was connected to Gacy, who perhaps had never made the connection between the person who didn't come home and the news coverage of the house on West Somerdale Avenue. The last identification at the time of this writing was made in 2021 through the specific combination of DNA analysis and genealogical research that has transformed cold case identification work across American law enforcement in recent years. The victim identified had been unknown since his body was recovered from beneath Gacy's house in December of 1978, more than 40 years earlier. His family received the news that their missing relative had been found. Whatever the particular texture of that notification, whatever it meant to learn, after decades of not knowing, both that the person was dead and how and where, is something that belongs to the family and that the formal record of the identification can only gesture toward. There remain, at this writing, victims whose identities have not yet been established, young men and boys whose names are not in any record that has been matched against the genetic material recovered from the crawl space, whose families may not know to be looking or may themselves be dead, or may simply not yet have been reached by the ongoing effort to close the last of the open files. The house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue was demolished in 1979, shortly after the investigation concluded. The lot was sold, and a new house was built on it, a different house, belonging to different people who did not want the address or the history attached to it, but who understood that what had happened beneath the previous house would follow any structure built on that ground forever, that the address itself was inseparable from what it had contained. The neighborhood of Norwood Park Township is still a residential suburb on the northwest side of Chicago. The streets look the way residential suburban streets look, neat and tree-lined and domestic, in the way that suburban domestic landscapes have always been presented as the visual language of safety and normalcy and everything fine with the American family. The house is gone. The street continues. The neighbors who attended the parties and noticed the smell and explained it away have aged through the decades since, and most of the accounts they gave in the immediate aftermath of the investigation have by now been given again, in retrospect, in documentaries and books and podcasts, through the specific lens of knowing what the smell actually was, of understanding, from a distance of years, what they had sat at a table above. What the Gacy case revealed, and what it continues to reveal each time it is examined with the seriousness it requires, is something about the nature of the ordinary. Not about evil as something exotic or visibly monstrous, not about danger as something that announces itself through the conventional visual vocabulary of threat, but about the specific and terrible possibility that the most dangerous thing in a neighborhood can look exactly like the most ordinary thing, can hand you a beer and ask after your family and perform at your child's birthday party and manage a successful contracting business and serve as a precinct captain and shake the hand of the First Lady of the United States, and all the while be doing what is being done in the crawl space beneath the house, where you watch him stand on the porch on a summer evening, waving at the neighbors driving by. The clown makeup is the image that has lasted longest in the public memory of the Gacy case. The white face paint and the red wig and the painted grin of Pogo, which has become in the cultural iconography of the case a kind of symbol of what his public performance always was, a face drawn over another face, a performed identity that existed specifically to prevent the perception of the identity beneath it. The clown is the concealment made literal, the mask wearing a mask, the man who was many things to many people being, in the very act of literal costume and grease paint, what he was always doing in a metaphorical sense throughout all the years of the murders, presenting a surface that was designed to disarm and to delight and to prevent the perception of what it covered. He was not a monster in the sense of a visible deviation from the human form. He was a man who looked like a man and moved through the world with the social ease of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of being seen as exactly what he appeared to be. That is what makes the case return. Not the spectacle of a singular and identifiable evil, but the ordinary terrible possibility that the crawl space beneath a suburban house can contain 33 people, and the neighbors can smell something odd and explain it away, and the investigators can enter the space and come back up through the trapdoor and attribute the smell to dampness, and the man who put them there can bring coffee to the people watching his house and wave at them from the porch, and 14 people who reported what he did to them can be insufficiently heard, and none of this is the result of any single catastrophic failure of judgment or system, but of the accumulated weight of small, ordinary decisions to give the benefit of the doubt to the person who looked like someone you could trust. The 33 dead are the center of the story. They are what the story is made of, beneath all the analysis and the cultural commentary and the psychological profiling and the debate about what Gacy was or wasn't, and what produced him, and what could or couldn't have stopped him. 33 young men and boys who went to speak with a contractor, or got into a car, or answered a job offer, or were somewhere on the specific margins of the world that made them available to something that found them there, and who did not come back, and whose families waited, some of them for years, some of them for decades, some of them still waiting, for the particular knowledge of what happened that the crawl space finally gave, and the ongoing identification work continues to deliver, one name at a time, into the permanent and unchangeable record of what occurred in the ordinary suburb on the northwest side of Chicago, in the house with the neat yard and the covered porch, below which 33 people were buried by a man who then went inside and cooked dinner and went to sleep, and in the morning got up and lived his life. That is the case. That is the whole of it, and none of it is resolved by the execution or by the demolition of the house or by the years of analysis that have been applied to the psychology of the man who did it. The families of the 33 carry the case with them in the specific form of the knowledge they have and the knowledge they don't have, in the shape of what was taken from them and the shape of the life that was not lived. Robert Piest would have been in his 50s now. The youngest of the victims, those who were 14 and 15, would be in their 60s. They had futures. They had mornings ahead of them that were taken away before they could arrive at them, in a crawl space beneath a house in a suburb that looked, from the street, exactly like every other house on the street, which is to say, like a place where nothing of consequence was happening, where life was proceeding in its ordinary and unremarkable way, where the smell was just the smell, and the man on the porch was just the neighbor, and everything was, as it had always appeared to be, fine. It was not fine. It had not been fine for years. It would not be understood as anything other than fine until the December night, when an investigator went into the crawl space with a flashlight, and the full weight of the case fell, all at once, on everyone who had been too close to see it. The smell is the thing the neighbors noticed. The smell is what they explain away in the decades of telling. The smell is what the case finally asks everyone who hears it to hold on to. The thing that is wrong, that is easier to explain than to confront. The thing beneath the surface, that the surface is designed to prevent you from investigating. The ordinary horror of a life that is not what it appears to be, in a house that is not what it appears to be, in a neighborhood that is not and was not and has not been since, simply a neighborhood anymore. To understand what Gacy was, it is necessary to understand what he understood about himself, and what he understood about himself was, in a deeply important sense, the opposite of what the evidence of his crimes reveals. He believed, and maintained through the Iowa conviction, and the marriage, and the building of the suburban life, and the years of the killing, and the trial, and the death row years, and the execution, that he was fundamentally a good person who had been treated unjustly, that the people who had failed to appreciate him, his father first, and then the legal system, and then the media, were the problem, that the thing he had done to 33 people was separable from the person he considered himself to be. This belief, which most people who encounter it in the record of his interviews and his writings find incomprehensible, was not incomprehensible to the psychologists who evaluated him or to the researchers who have spent careers studying people who have committed comparable acts. It is, in fact, a recognizable feature of the specific personality structure that the case exemplifies. A structure characterized by an almost total inability to experience the damage done to others as damage in any way connected to oneself, a capacity to partition the acts of violence from the social self with such completeness that the social self continues to function and even to flourish while the acts accumulate, a kind of moral blindness that is not the same as insanity, not the same as the absence of the ability to know what one is doing, but the presence of a specific kind of self-protective structure that prevents the doing from being felt as the responsibility that it is. Gacy knew what he was doing. This is the point that the jury made in its 2-hour deliberation, and it is the point that the psychological evidence supports despite the genuine complexity of his personality structure. He bought the lime. He dug the crawl space deeper to accommodate more bodies. He researched the methods he used. He planned his approach to his victims. He assessed the risk each victim posed and managed that risk with the practical intelligence he applied to his contracting work. He was not someone in the grip of a compulsion he could not interrupt, if the criterion for that compulsion is the total absence of rational control. He was someone who had made, at the level of fundamental choice and fundamental identity, a decision about what the lives of other people were worth relative to his own desires, a decision so embedded in his psychology that it operated with the ease and the invisibility of a value rather than a choice. The specific focus of his violence on young men and boys has been analyzed in the context of his own sexuality, which was something he acknowledged only partially and with evident difficulty even in the years of the death row interviews, when disclosure cost him nothing and the discomfort it produced was the only remaining privacy he had to protect. He had been married twice to women. He had maintained, in both marriages and in his broader social life, the presentation of a heterosexual identity, partly because heterosexuality was the identity that the social world of his time and his specific community rewarded, and partly because his own understanding of his sexuality was apparently something he had never fully reconciled within himself, something his father's contempt for weakness and effeminacy had made impossible to acknowledge without simultaneously acknowledging his own inadequacy by his father's terms. The violence was not simply an expression of sexual desire, though the sexual element was present in the crimes. It was also, and perhaps more fundamentally, an expression of power, of the specific power that comes from complete control over another person, the power that his father had exercised over him in the form of contempt and physical punishment, and that he reproduced in its most extreme form in what he did in the house on West Summerdale Avenue. The crawl space was the literal inversion of the household of his childhood, the place where he was the one with the power, where the other person was the one who had no options, where the dynamic of helplessness that had defined his earliest understanding of the world was reproduced with himself in the position he had never been able to occupy in that original household. This analysis, which has been offered by various psychologists and criminologists in the decades since the case, does not excuse or reduce or mitigate what Gacy did. Nothing in the psychological record of a childhood, however damaging, constitutes an explanation that carries moral exculpatory weight for the murder of 33 people. But it is part of understanding what happened, and understanding what happened is the only mechanism available for building the frameworks that might prevent comparable things from happening in the future, which is the only practical purpose that the sustained, difficult study of cases like this one actually serves. The specific social context of Norwood Park Township in the 1970s, the specific social world of the Chicago suburb where Gacy built his life and conducted his crimes, has features worth examining at length, because the context shaped both what was possible for him to do and what was difficult for the people around him to see. Norwood Park Township in the early 1970s was the kind of community that had been built on specific post-war American assumptions about what a neighborhood was and what the people who lived in good neighborhoods were like, assumptions that valued visible ordinariness, that treated the presentation of normative behavior as evidence of normative character, that organized itself around the shared confidence that the kind of life lived on a street like West Summerdale Avenue was the kind of life in which certain things simply did not happen. The barbecues were real parties. The food was genuinely good. The neighbors genuinely liked him. These facts have sometimes been treated as if they are merely the surface under which the horror was concealed, as if the parties were simply a mechanism, entirely cynical, for maintaining the cover that allowed the killing to continue. This interpretation is probably too simple. Gacy appears to have genuinely enjoyed the parties, to have experienced something in the role of the generous host that satisfied something real in him, the same thing that the JCs had satisfied and the political precinct work had satisfied, the need to be at the center, to be recognized, to be the person everyone was glad to see. The horror and the ordinariness were not in opposition. They coexisted. They were both real. They fed from the same fundamental psychology, the same need that expressed itself as a love of being the center of a party and as the absolute control over another person that the crawl space represented. The specific years of the killing, 1972 to 1978, were years in which the concept of serial murder as a distinct category of criminal behavior was only beginning to be formally developed in American law enforcement. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, which would become the center of American serial killer profiling in the late 1970s and 1980s, was in its early stages during the years Gacy was most active. The concept of VICAP, the database that would eventually allow investigators to cross-reference violent crimes across jurisdictions, did not yet exist. The specific pattern of victim selection that Gacy employed, the targeting of a population whose disappearances were likely to receive less immediate institutional attention, was not yet understood as a pattern that might itself be a signature of a particular kind of predatory behavior. In this investigative environment, each of the disappearances that preceded Robert Piest's was, to the investigators who received the initial report, a single missing person case rather than one instance in a series, a case with its own specific circumstances and its own specific investigation or lack thereof, not connected to the other cases by any mechanism that the investigative infrastructure of the time had been built to recognize. The connection that Robert Keppel and the other investigators who later developed serial killer profiling methodology would have been trained to look for, the connection between the specific characteristics of victims, the geography of disappearances, the operational signature of a consistent method across multiple cases, was simply not part of the investigative toolkit that the Des Plaines Police or the Cook County Sheriff's investigators brought to the cases as they occurred. This is not an excuse for the institutional failures the case documented. The Jeffrey Rignall complaint alone, with its specific identification of Gacy as the perpetrator of a violent assault, should have been sufficient to trigger a serious investigation that might have uncovered what Gacy was before Robert Piest disappeared. The failure to adequately investigate that complaint was a failure that had specific human consequences, consequences measurable in the number of young men who disappeared between 1977 and December of 1978, between Rignall's assault and Piest's disappearance. It is a failure that the Des Plaines Police and Cook County investigators have had to live with, that the families of the victims from those months have had to live with, in the specific form of knowing that the investigation that ultimately stopped Gacy could theoretically have happened a year or more earlier. Lieutenant Joseph Kosenchak, the Des Plaines investigator who drove to the house on West Summerdale Avenue 2 days after Robert Piest disappeared, and who continued to push the investigation with the urgency that Elizabeth Piest's determination helped to sustain, has described in subsequent accounts the specific texture of those December days, the gathering momentum of an investigation that kept producing evidence that something was very wrong, while the full scale of what was wrong remained just out of reach. He has described standing outside the house in the cold and looking at the lit windows and knowing, in the way investigators sometimes know things before they have the evidence to confirm them, that the situation was more serious than even the circumstances already established could account for. The excavation of the crawl space, which took more than 2 weeks and required the rotation of investigators through shifts in conditions that the December cold and the nature of what was being excavated made extremely difficult, produced evidence that was organized and documented and processed with a professionalism that the scale of the task and the psychological weight of what was being done are, in retrospect, remarkable. The forensic work done in those weeks established the physical record of the case, the specific locations and conditions of each set of remains, the analysis of what could be determined about each individual from what had survived the years in the crawl space, the beginning of the identification process that would continue, in some cases, for decades. The families who were contacted during and after the excavation, who received the notification that investigators believed they had found the person they had been looking for, experienced a form of grief that is distinctive and that has been described in the accounts of those who received such notifications as something that does not fit neatly into the ordinary vocabulary of loss. They had, in many cases, been waiting for years, had been living in the specific suspension between not knowing and not wanting to know, between the hope that the missing person might still be alive somewhere, and the knowledge that the probability of this diminished with each year that passed. The confirmation that the search was over, delivered in the form of a forensic identification rather than a reunion, is a specific kind of terrible resolution, the closing of one kind of uncertainty into another. Robert Piest's mother, Elizabeth, who had reported her son missing on his birthday and who had pursued the investigation with the determination that is credited by many of the investigators involved as a significant factor in the pace at which the case developed, received confirmation that her son's body had been recovered from the Illinois River in April of 1979, 4 months after he disappeared. She has remained, in the years since, a figure associated with victim advocacy, with the effort to ensure that the systemic failures documented in the Gacy case are not simply recorded and forgotten, but are understood as requiring specific and ongoing institutional correction. The institutional corrections that the Gacy case prompted are real and are part of the case's legacy, though they exist in uneasy tension with the ongoing reality of cases that continue to fall through the gaps that the reforms were designed to close. The Illinois sex offender registry laws were strengthened in the years following the case. The standards for missing persons reporting and investigation were revised. The advocacy for law enforcement's attention to the disappearances of people from vulnerable and marginalized populations has been sustained by the families of Gacy's victims and by the organizations that took up the cause in the years after the case, arguing that the failure to adequately investigate complaints from gay men and from young men on the margins of the formal social structure was both a moral failure and an operational failure that had direct and measurable consequences in the deaths of people who might have been saved. The 13 years between Gacy's conviction in 1980 and his execution in 1994 were years in which the case occupied a specific and uncomfortable place in American public consciousness, the place reserved for cases that have been legally resolved but not culturally absorbed. Cases that the society has technically put away, but that continue to surface in the conversations and the documentaries and the books and the specific way that certain crimes become reference points, things that people invoke to locate the extreme edge of what human beings have done in recognizable settings to other human beings. The paintings he produced during those years, which exist in private collections across the country, have been the subject of periodic public debate about whether they should be owned and displayed, about what the existence of a market for them says about the relationship between American culture and the cases it finds most compelling. This debate does not resolve easily. Art produced by people who have committed terrible acts is not the same as those acts, and does not carry their moral weight, and the impulse to destroy it, rather than allow it to exist in the world, is understandable, but is also a form of erasure that does not obviously serve any useful purpose. At the same time, The market for Gacy's clown paintings reflects something real about how the case is held in the imagination, something that sits on the wrong side of the line between understanding and fascination, between engaging seriously with the horror of what the case represents and consuming that horror as a kind of entertainment whose primary beneficiary is the person who created the paintings. This tension between the serious and the sensational, between the engagement that produces understanding and the engagement that produces only the particular dark pleasure of proximity to extreme violence, is present in every engagement with the Gacy case and with cases like it, and it is a tension that does not resolve through any individual choice about what to include or exclude from any particular account. The case is what it is. The 33 dead are what they are. The man who killed them was who he was. The house stood where it stood. The crawl space contained what it contained. What we make of all of this, how we hold it and what we do with it, is the only thing that remains available to be decided. The last words on the Gacy case, if there are to be last words, belong to the names that the ongoing identification work continues to recover from the record of the crawl space and the river. Each name that is attached to a set of remains is a restoration, however belated and however partial, of the specific personhood that the crawl space had anonymized, a small act of corrective insistence that the person who died was a person, with a name, with a family, with a life before the moment of their death that deserves to be in the record alongside the record of how and where and by whom the life was ended. The identification work will continue. The names that remain unknown may eventually be found. The families that are still waiting may eventually receive the specific and terrible knowledge that other families have received across the decades since December of 1978. Until then, the cases remain open, and the unknown individuals in the record of the crawl space retain the anonymity that Gacy's concealment imposed on them, an anonymity that the passage of time has deepened rather than resolved, that the development of forensic science is slowly working against, but has not yet fully overcome. They were someone's children. They were someone's brothers and sons and, in some cases, someone's parents, people with connections to other lives that were broken by their absence and that have been organized, in the decades since, around the specific emptiness that unexplained and unresolved loss produces. The work of finding their names is the work of giving back what was taken in the crawl space, the most basic thing, the specific human identity that outlasts the body, and that the record of what happened on West Somerdale Avenue continues to owe them. The house is gone. The neighborhood continues. The smell is gone. The names are being found, one at a time, across the decades, by the work of investigators and genealogists and families who understand that the case is not done as long as there are people in it who are not yet known by name. That work is the only remaining response adequate to what happened in the crawl space of the ordinary house, on the quiet street, in the suburb, on the northwest side of Chicago, in the home of the man who hosted the barbecues and performed as a clown, and served as a precinct captain, and brought coffee to the people watching his house, and waved at them from the porch, and was, beneath all of it, in the crawl space beneath all of it, what he was. What he was is the question the case continues to ask, and the answer the case continues to insist upon, and the thing that the specific human horror of 33 names demands be held clearly and permanently in the record, alongside every other thing that is held there. He was a murderer. He was a man who killed 33 people and buried them in his crawl space and lived above them. The rest of what he was, the contractor and the precinct captain and the clown and the host, exists in the record too, and it exists there not to mitigate what he did, but to explain why no one stopped him sooner, why the smell was explained away, why the complaints went unreported or were reported and not adequately pursued, why the crawl space was entered and exited in December without the excavation that it needed. The ordinariness was the weapon. The ordinariness was what made the 33 possible. And the ordinariness is what the case leaves with everyone who examines it closely enough to understand that the crawl space was always there, and that what it took to see it was not special investigative ability or exceptional intelligence, but simply the willingness to follow the smell to where it led, to take seriously the thing that was easier to explain away, to look at the ordinary surface and ask, with the discipline that the ordinary surface is specifically designed to prevent, what is on the other side? The other side was the crawl space. The other side was 33. The other side is what the case of John Wayne Gacy is, and what it remains, and what it will continue to be for as long as there are names in the record that have not yet been given back to the people they belong to, and for as long as the question of what hides inside the ordinary has not yet been answered with anything other than the long and incomplete and ongoing reckoning that began in December of 1978 when an investigator went into the crawl space with a flashlight and came back up with the knowledge of what was there. The specific geography of the case, the particular suburban landscape that Gacy inhabited and used, deserves more sustained attention than it has sometimes received in the broader cultural conversation about him, because the geography is not incidental to the story, it is part of the story. The suburb is what made the concealment possible in the particular way it was possible, what made the crawl space and the parties and the years of undisturbed killing a feature of a specific kind of American landscape rather than any landscape, any setting where a man with a house and a yard and neighbors and a community role could build and maintain the specific dual life that Gacy built and maintained. Norwood Park Township was, and remains, a place built around the idea that neighborhoods mean something, that knowing your neighbors and attending their events and eating their food and watching their children play constitutes a web of mutual knowledge and mutual accountability that makes the community safer and better than any of its constituent parts would be alone. The community barbecue, the neighborhood watch, the civic organization, the Little League team, the community political engagement, all of these are expressions of the same fundamental belief that living near people means knowing them, and knowing them means being able to trust them, and being able to trust them means being able to live with the specific relaxation of vigilance that trust permits. Gacy understood this and exploited it with the precision of someone who had spent his entire life studying the social mechanisms of trust and approval. He did not simply happen to live in a community organized around these values. He actively embedded himself in those structures, joined the JCs and the Democratic Party and the community events circuit, became the person who was known as a neighbor and an organizer and a clown and a contractor, became the person whose presence at any community event was an ordinary and unremarkable feature of the landscape, someone whose visibility was so consistent and so positively weighted in the minds of those around him that the idea of attributing something wrong to him required overriding a social reality they had been building for years, a social reality he had helped construct for exactly this purpose. This is why the smell was explained away. Not because the neighbors were obtuse or irresponsible, but because the smell coming from the house of someone they knew and liked and had eaten with and seen perform as a clown at a neighborhood birthday party required them to entertain a thought that the entire weight of their social experience of the man contradicted. The specific cognitive work required to hold both things simultaneously, the known neighbor and the unthinkable smell, and to take seriously the possibility that the smell was what it would have had to be given the truth of the situation, is more than most people, in ordinary circumstances, are equipped to do. The social reality of knowing someone, of having built over years a sense of who they are, is a very powerful filter through which any single piece of evidence that contradicts that sense must pass. And the filter is powerful precisely because it is built from real experience and real relationship. This is the lesson the Gacy case teaches about community, the hardest and most counterintuitive lesson, which is that community itself, the web of mutual knowledge and mutual trust that should provide protection, can under certain specific conditions provide cover instead. The very things that should make a neighborhood safer, the familiarity and the trust and the shared social world, can be exactly what makes it impossible to see the thing that is happening inside the most familiar house on the street. The monster who presents himself as a neighbor is harder to see than the monster who presents himself as a stranger, and the community that knows and trusts the neighbor is in that specific sense less able to protect itself than the community of strangers would be. None of this means that community is wrong, or that trust is a mistake, or that the JCs and the neighborhood barbecue and the civic organization are things to be abandoned because one person in one suburb once used them as cover for 33 murders. It means that the specific trust that community generates needs to coexist with the specific willingness to take seriously the evidence that contradicts it, that the smell needs to be investigated even when the person whose house it is coming from is someone you know and like, that the complaint from a young man who says he was assaulted by someone who has a photo ID and a photo with the First Lady needs to be investigated with the same urgency as a complaint against someone who looks more like the conventional image of a threat. The systemic lessons of the Gacy case have been incorporated, to varying degrees and with varying success, into the law enforcement and victim advocacy frameworks that were developed or reformed in the wake of the case. Missing persons protocols were revised. Sex offender registry requirements were strengthened. The specific attention to complaints from gay male victims and from victims in marginal social positions was addressed at the level of policy by advocacy organizations that emerged partly in response to the documented failures of the Gacy investigation. Whether these reforms have been sufficient, whether they have produced the specific improvements in investigative practice and in the treatment of vulnerable complainants that the case demanded, is a question that advocates in those areas continue to press. What cannot be reformed is the past. The 33 victims of the crawl space at West Somerdale Avenue are dead, and the years of their absence from the lives of the people who loved them are years that cannot be recovered. The families who waited for identification, who received notifications in some cases decades after the deaths themselves, are people who have lived the intervening decades in the specific shape that the absence created, who have built lives around a hole that the knowledge of what happened in the crawl space either filled with a different kind of grief or left partially unfilled because the identification has not yet come. The ongoing identification work is the last active dimension of the case, the dimension in which new information continues to emerge, in which families continue to be reached, in which the record of what happened in the crawl space continues to be completed, one name at a time. The Cook County Sheriff's Office maintains a website for the Gacy victims where families can submit DNA profiles to be compared against the genetic material recovered from the remains, and where periodic updates are posted when new identifications are made. This digital presence, this ongoing institutional commitment to completing the identification of every person in the crawl space, is itself a kind of justice, a specific acknowledgement that the case is not done until every person in it has their name in the record, until the anonymity that the crawl space imposed is fully and finally reversed. The last identification made before the time of this narration was in 2021, more than 40 years after the December excavation. The identified victim had been carried in the record for more than 4 decades as an unknown, a number rather than a name, a set of physical characteristics rather than a history. The family that received the notification had been waiting for that long, or some members of it had, and the generation that had known the missing person and reported the disappearance and lived through the years of not knowing had in some cases aged through that waiting and died without the specific knowledge that the 2021 identification delivered. This is the temporal dimension of the case that is hardest to hold with any equanimity, the dimension in which the ordinary human measurement of what 40 years means, what it means to wait 40 years for the specific terrible knowledge that a person you loved was killed in a crawl space in a suburb in the 1970s, is brought to bear on the abstract fact of the unidentified remains, and produces something that is not simply sad, but is a specific and enduring injustice, the injustice of time, denied as surely as the injustice of life denied. The case of John Wayne Gacy is a case that has never fully ended. The trial ended. The sentence was executed. The house was demolished. The man is dead. But the case is still open, in the specific sense that the last of the victims have not yet been identified, and in the broader sense that the questions it asks about ordinary life and ordinary community and the specific nature of the concealment that a certain kind of person can build inside the architecture of ordinary things are questions that have not stopped being relevant since December of 1978, that are not answerable by the specific institutional reforms that the case produced, that remain alive in the ongoing human attempt to understand what is possible inside the ordinary life of a neighbor, a contractor, a clown. A clown is the image that stays. Pogo, the white face and the red wig and the painted grin, the Gacy painting that sold to collectors and that appears in the cultural record of the case as the symbol the case seems to demand. The face drawn over the face, the performance of the benign and the joyful and the child-friendly over the thing that lay beneath it. He painted Pogo for the collectors. He understood, at some level, that the clown was the image that communicated what he had been, even if his understanding of what he had been remained, to the end, the inverted understanding of someone who saw himself as the victim of the story rather than its perpetrator. He was the perpetrator. The 33 are the victims. The clown is the concealment. The crawl space is the truth. These are the fixed points of the case, the things that do not change with the analysis, or the years, or the appeals, or the death row interviews, or the paintings, or the ongoing cultural conversation about what John Wayne Gacy means. He killed 33 people. He buried 29 of them in his crawl space. He threw 4 more into the river. He continued to live above the dead. He continued to party and perform and run his business and serve his community and shake hands and wave at the surveillance cars and bring coffee to the investigators who sat outside his house in the December cold. He did all of this. The 33 did not get to do any of it. They had the years he had, or some version of them, and then they did not, and the years after that, which he had and they did not, are the dimension of the case that the families carry most specifically and most permanently in the specific form of everything that the missing person did not get to experience, every birthday and graduation and ordinary Tuesday that the absence organized itself around. The neighborhood continues, as neighborhoods do, as communities of ordinary life proceeding in its ordinary way, the way it always proceeded on West Somerdale Avenue before December of 1978, and the way it has proceeded since, with the knowledge that the case left behind, now part of the address's permanent record, a feature of the geography that the geography itself does not acknowledge, and does not explain, and does not, in the way that places sometimes seem to, remember. The smell is the last thing. After everything else, after the trial and the execution, and the paintings, and the ongoing identification, and the institutional reforms, and the 40-year wait for names, the smell is what remains in the account of people who were there. The neighbors who noticed it and explained it away. The first investigators who entered the crawl space and came back up. The forensic teams who worked through the December cold for 2 weeks. The smell is what the case began with, what preceded all the understanding, what the geography of the house on West Somerdale Avenue communicated before anyone was willing to hear it, before the investigation had reached the point where what the smell was saying was the thing that had to be followed rather than the thing that was easier to explain. Follow the smell. That is what the Gacy case asks. Follow it to where it leads, past the comfortable explanation and the trusted neighbor and the photo with the First Lady and the years of barbecues and the community role and the clown performances. Follow it through all of that and down through the trapdoor and into the crawl space, into the dark beneath the ordinary life, into the place where what was actually happening was happening, the place that the ordinary life above it was designed, with extraordinary consistency and extraordinary care, to make invisible. It was not invisible. The smell was there. The cases were there. The complaints were there. The truth was there, beneath the floor, in the dark, for 6 years, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting for the specific willingness to follow where the evidence led, rather than where the comfortable explanation pointed, waiting for December of 1978, and the investigator with the flashlight, and the 33 names, and the families, and the decades of identification work, and the question that the case leaves, with everyone who encounters it, and cannot leave behind. The question is not who John Wayne Gacy was. We know who he was. He was a man who killed 33 people and buried them in his crawl space and continued to live above them. The question is the other one, the one the neighborhood was asked and did not answer in time, the one that every community organized around trust and mutual knowledge is always implicitly being asked and answering without being aware that it is being asked. The question of what is in the crawl space of the ordinary life. What is beneath the floor of the familiar house? What the smell that has a comfortable explanation is actually communicating, and whether anyone is willing, given everything that the familiar house represents in terms of known and trusted community, to take the smell seriously enough to find out. That is the question the Gacy case leaves. It has been there since December of 1978. It will be there as long as the case is remembered and as long as the last of the 33 remains without a name, and perhaps longer than that, because the question does not require the Gacy case to remain current in order to remain relevant. It requires only the ongoing existence of ordinary neighborhoods and ordinary neighbors and ordinary houses above which something might be happening that the ordinary surfaces above are specifically, and sometimes very effectively, designed to conceal. The 33 are the answer to what was in the crawl space on West Summerdale Avenue. They are the moral weight of the question, and the only weight that matters. The weight of 33 specific lives and 33 specific absences, and the families organized around those absences, and the years of waiting, and the identifications, delivered one at a time across the decades, and the names going into the record, one at a time, slowly, the way truth sometimes moves when it is recovering from being buried, slowly and with great effort, and with the kind of patience that only the people who have been waiting the longest are fully equipped to understand.